Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to hear from Dr. McKenna. Rob is the CEO of Wild Leaders, a renowned expert in leadership development and celebrated for his groundbreaking work in fostering trust, driving performance, and connecting business strategy with the human side of leadership. Dr. McKenna has over 2 decades of research and practical experience that position him as a thought leader in crafting sustainable, people centered organizations. His innovations and innovative methods bridge the divide between strategic business goals and the emotional and relational needs of leaders, teams, and individuals, creating thriving cultures that deliver results. Today, we get to hear a conversation about the courage to connect, breaking barriers, and building whole community.
When you've had great community around you, what's been different? Without community, we are left to feel like we are alone in our experience. When we have a community of people around us who share our experiences, our life stages, our challenges, and our victories, everything changes. And if that's true, why do we struggle to be connected in community? And where do we begin to start? Where do we start building it again? And whether you had a community in which you belonged and lost it, or whether the community around you changed, and so you need a renewal in community, that you need that renewal happening, we all need a place to be challenged, to be supported and accepted for our whole selves. And throughout history, it's impossible to find a reference to any moment where groups of people didn't come together for a common purpose. If you put human beings together, they will create a thing called an organization. We organized and we organized together. And long before we organized, we were drawn to other people to be with, to be known by, to get something done with, to belong to be embraced by, to love and be loved by, and who are our biggest reminder that we're not alone. Communities are powerful things. Communities are groups of people who have come together for a common reason. And while they often share some kind of proximity, like their formation is sometimes intentional and oftentimes formed out of necessity, whether it's our need to belong, a shared need or desire to do something together, these are all representations of people coming together who share something, a community. And whether it's raising our kids with others, doing the same, coming together to learn, or a group of people who go on mission together, a church, a community center, a book club, these are all the communities that change who we are and who we will be forever. But there's one more characteristic of true communities. True community is a place where we can be as close to real as ever we imagine possible. And in that way, communities are places where we most deeply experience our aspiration to wholeness. Some have argued that our sense of community has diminished in the wake of our individualism or our growing distrust of the institution of, whether it's our local communities, our government, our church, or institutions in general, organizations, or of each other. But regardless, we will always need each other. And if you ask me about communities I knew about growing up in urban Seattle in the 1970s and 1980s, I would have immediately associated community with what was called the love family. And as a kid, I knew them as a mysterious commune of people all living in one big house up the street from my childhood home. And they looked like typical hippies if you saw them on the street, sandals, lots of wool clothes, tie-dye shirts. They looked like a Woodstock poster in essence. But there were lots of rumors among the kids in my neighborhood about the Love family, and many of which may have been true. I don't know. But it was lots of men and women all living together under one roof. And the rumor was that there was lots of partner swapping going on and everyone just sharing everything. And while they were called the Love family, I don't think even one of us kids ever talked to one of them. They seemed unapproachable, different, and even mysteriously scary as a kid. But it was clear that they had each other, at least for that season of their lives, and they lived in community. And while I didn't understand the Love family when I was a kid, I experienced my own community that started when our kids were young through a community we were a part of. And what started out with as a dinner group of families deciding to have meals together eventually turned into a group of 5 to 7 families raising our kids together. And it was originally called Man Group, based on the fathers in this group who started meeting to create intentionality in our own work lives and work. And even though it began as a group of dads, it quickly became about a group of families who were experiencing a life stage together. All our kids were young, and we were trying to figure out lots of things. How to parent. We read every self-help book on sleep you can possibly imagine. How to be married, how to do life. This group of families has raised our kids together. And many of the members of that community had other amazing communities as well. But for every one of us, it has been and was very, very powerful. We camped together. We went to a farm every year together. We struggled in marriages together. We experienced the death of parents together. We had dinner together. We celebrated New Year's Eve together. We wrote letters to the kids when they turned 13 together and sent them off to college together. And someday we will marry them off and together and experience them bringing their own children into this world together. The psychologist in me has always been comforted by the research that showed that kids with strong attachment to others outside of their immediate family experience all kinds of benefits later. And to this day, if you ask my sons about what Man Group has meant to them, you would get a lifetime of stories. And I know our experience was more rare than common. The reality is that our need for community is part of our whole story. We are all fighting for community. The challenge in our modern world is that our sense and need for community has been disrupted by distractions, distrust, and a perceived connectedness through social media that could be more isolating than connecting. Building community requires intention, openness, and even a bit of risk and sacrifice, and sometimes forgiveness. I would never minimize how challenging it is to establish community, nor its importance. What is it with our need for community? And what in the world does that have to do with leading, organizing, and the rest of our lives? Very few of us would deny the power of doing life with others and feeling a sense of going through it together. And very few of us would deny that a lack of community, or at least our perceptions of its lack, plagues us at different times in our lives. Community is all about people who come together, oftentimes living or working close to one another, who share something in common. Community is about commonality or similarity in experience or in something else that gives us something we share. It's not necessarily about work, but about doing life together and near one another. And at the beginning of 2020, right at the start of the global pandemic, the leadership team in my organization was trying to figure out how to serve those within our sphere of influence at a time when resources were shorter for everyone. And everything about work outside of certain services had become virtual. And leaders were trying to figure out how to lead virtual teams and even more fundamentally, how to maintain a sense of team and community when people were no longer going to be face to face. And in March of 2020, we decided to launch what was called the Wild Conversation, a 1 hour virtual meeting that would give people a chance to talk about the most important and sometimes controversial aspects of leading and living. What we also did was architect the hour so that it wasn't a webinar or an online training or a keynote, but an intentional and structured conversation. We planned it in a way that people would get to know each other very quickly in small groups for 5 minutes. Here's some content on great topics regarding whole leader development and trust. And then they would get a chance to talk about the topic together with the same small group. I remember thinking that first week, I wonder if anyone is going to come. Who is going to set aside an hour in their work week to come to be a part of some strange, wild conversation? I felt like the hundreds of pastors I've known who ask themselves every Sunday, is anyone going to show up to church today? The first week, nearly 40 people showed up, and we knew something important was happening. And at the beginning, we thought the wild conversation was about the content being presented each week and the place to talk about some deeper conversations regarding work, leading, organizations, and life. And soon we realized it was about something more. The wild conversation quickly became a fellowship of people who knew one another and who needed one another. This conversation and virtual moment became a place where deep and whole community was being formed. And as several leaders have said to me, the wild conversation has sustained me through this season. And as another leader said to me, I don't know how you guys do it, but within 15 minutes, I feel like I have 4 or 5 new friends, real friends. So we kept going and offering that Friday conversation every week. Who would have thought that a conversation architected around some of the most challenging topics imaginable would build community that fast? But it did. And today, an average of 50 to 80 leaders were a part of the weekly wild conversation. And the number of people who have attended is now in the thousands. It wasn't hard to do, but it was intentional. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because we noticed a need and saw the opportunity to architect an experience around powerful topics with the assumption that the most important part was not going to be the content, but that the content would be the lit fuse that would create an explosion of important conversations. The wild conversation created a community of people seeking wholeness and seeking it together. And to this date, hundreds of real relationships have been created as a result of the wild conversation and other communities connected to it. The wild conversation brought other communities of movement together in ways I could not have imagined. The leaders who got to know each other during that hour on Fridays have helped others help each other get jobs. They've helped them get jobs, inspired each other to join their own movements, and connected CEOs, students, security professionals, parents, firefighters, diversity and inclusion experts, church leaders, therapists, educators, not for profit leaders, sales leaders, investment bankers, and wealth managers, government officials, all together to learn from each other, to support each other, to grow their capacity as leaders. I've asked myself many times, what is the common factor that brought them together? And here's what I know. We invited a certain kind of person. We invited people who were willing to change, to not have all the answers, and to those knowing they needed grace and are open to offering it. We invited people who felt called to show kindness to others, knowing that without intention they might do otherwise. We invited leaders willing to edit and to learn, and we protected that and clearly communicated the rules of engagement that would hopefully ensure that type of community was maintained and protected. We openly would say, if you have all the answers or want to sell something or have it all figured out, this isn't the conversation for you. But if you're open to editing yourself for the sake of others, no matter how high on the ladder you've climbed, please come. It is a community of people who have now supported each other through huge transitions, through death, divorces, loss of children, troubled teams. They manage those teams and career failures and successes. Another common factor was that most of them did not work together every day. Some did, some do. And that has made it a safe place. It always made it a safe place to deal with the realities of leading in their own context. And in a day where many of us have felt a sense of isolation, where causes have become the primary headline, who is responsible for giving us community? We commonly use the phrase community building without much attention to how they are actually formed. And in many cases, we've begun to expect our organizations and our leaders to provide community in our workplaces. And this begs a big question. Are our organizational leaders responsible for providing us with community in our work, or at least giving us the autonomy to build our own? It's a good question because communities of practice do exist. The reality is that we likely need multiple communities. We need many communities because our needs for belonging and for learning and for figuring out life and work together, there's so many. And communities are typically people who come together voluntarily around a shared mission. And in that sense, should we expect our workplaces to be communities? Maybe so. But if so, we would need to begin to invite people into them being very clear about the purpose. If an organization exists for profit, and if its members are there for that purpose, that is likely not a community, but a pure business. But if profit is a necessary goal related to a larger purpose, and individuals who join our organization understand that goal the moment they walk in the door by choice, then maybe community is what we're up to. And this also opens the door to people leaving as well at the moment that shared purpose is no longer shared. That doesn't only happen in organizations where with very well-intentioned leaders, it happens in the communities we raise our kids with and the communities who come together to support each other. Proximity, either virtual or literal, changes us and changes our needs, and so does the shift in life circumstances. Community is a choice, an invitation to do life or work together on purpose and to come alongside one another for as long as it is necessary. And it is necessary. And this highlights one of the biggest barriers to organizations providing community. And it's what I would add to our experience of great communities in our lives. Great communities are gatherings of people who come together for a common purpose or in a common phase of life, but there is one more attribute. Great communities allow us to be as close to our whole selves as we ever experience. In true communities, we feel closer to whole. And in so many cases, we don't feel that in the context of our workplaces. And that's why a leader willing to model just a sliver of vulnerability is such a powerful thing. It invites us to be our whole selves together. Vulnerability invites community. There are all kinds of reasons we fail to build or have community: being excluded, excluding ourselves, conflict avoidance or conflict abundance, feeling of being the only one, cliques and tribes, lack of courage to step out, a culture of individualism, short-term goals. And because many communities over the long haul, like building community over the long haul, takes work. Building community takes some intention, and it's not easy to maintain because communities are made up of people like us, and we aren't always easy to deal with. Wouldn't it be so much easier if we didn't have to deal with other people? If we could do our own thing, avoiding the conflicts, the convincing, the escalations, and just the dealings with other people and each other. That would be a nice for a while and for a very short while. Thomas Merton wrote a book called No Man is an Island, and I think he was right. All of us humans live our lives in this weird space of wanting to do it alone and our wired in need to do life together. And the whole story of our individuality and of our necessity for community is as much a part of our created being as breathing. And sometimes we just don't breathe well. Even in the most introverted among us needs a community of like-minded people who will challenge and support us, especially if we are to become the people and leaders we aspire to be. And over the years, I've often asked people what would change if they were surrounded by mentors, role models, cheerleaders, and people who give it to them straight. And when asked that question, people are immediately aware of the power of people who might do those things for them. They're immediately aware of their need for community and all that would change if they had it. But the question isn't a general one. It's asking about specific people doing specific things in their life. It's not just being surrounded, but being intentionally surrounded. Being with other people isn't enough. All of us have experienced deep loneliness in times where lots of people were around. Some of the loneliest people are married, go to lots of parties, lead large organizations, and are surrounded by so many. People aren't the answer to our feelings of isolation. Communities are. And while diversity matters, a community of like-minded people around us is just as important. Without community, leaders wither away or implode. And with strategic and intentional community, leaders will thrive. And that is why we have to work at it. Communities require intention. The space we feel between being surrounded and being isolated is important because it highlights our aspirations for something different, something more whole. Our feelings of loneliness won't disappear completely and be solved so that we move on to the next thing, but we'll need attention and care for the rest of our lives. To support a whole leader's necessity for community will require preparation for the likely feelings of isolation and a system that will allow them to do continual maintenance of their community. What is absolutely required is an intentional and courageous step that begins with an admission that you need others, followed by courageous steps toward others that may be a little scary at first.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our Wild Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.
So many things happen that are so important, not only for us, but for everyone in our sphere of influence. If we're surrounded in community with others, things change. The research on social support makes it clear when we're surrounded, things are better. When we're not, things tend to be worse. And getting surrounded is within reach, but sometimes require the courage to take a risk, to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to lean on others, to make new friends, and to recognize that without others, we are lost. Others won't solve all of our issues, but they will certainly help. And when you step out into community, big things might happen, things that may even outlast or outlive you. Whole communities of people who come together to edit, support, and invest in one another do crazy, wild things. Whole communities spread like wildfire and they multiply almost effortlessly. Whole communities encourage the necessary controversies that we have to face if we're to become better versions of ourselves for the sake of others. Whole communities built with intention start on one purpose and then they begin to solve other problems. Whole communities serve a purpose that is larger than any one person, but supports every one person at the same time. Whole communities give us a sense of belonging and becoming, of a place to be ourselves and a place to see who we might become. Whole communities challenge us and support us at the same moment. Whole communities solve local problems and in the long term serve our global problems. Whole communities understand the paradoxes of life and move toward them. Whole communities are intentional about welcoming new people, avoiding the temptation to only focus on who is already with us. Whole communities rally to the needs of the individuals. Whole communities build fortitude, resilience, courage, trust, and attitudes of sacrifice as opposed to self preservation. Whole communities expand the arms of grace and our understanding of how much grace we all need to receive and give. Whole communities surround us with like minded people from diverse contexts and backgrounds, and they are the difference between leaders being alone and leading in a vacuum, or being surrounded and leading together, which has such interesting connections into trust. Without trust, communities are never built, teams don't perform, and none of us feel as connected as we could. When we think of communities of people with impact, these are the communities of people who are working hard at creating the conditions we can trust, where we can trust each other. And yes, it takes hard work. Building trust begins within us and gets salient and tangible when we start to live and work together in community. But trust begins within us. Imagine being in community with someone who lacks purpose, doesn't understand themselves, or isn't in it for them without even a nod to the reality that living and working well is going to be about them being healthy and whole, but also about serving others and making sacrifices. When we bring a healthy level of awareness into the communities where we live and serve, and others do the same, long and sustaining trust begins to be built. A trust that changes everything and moves us from doing life alone to doing life and work together in the most profound and life-changing ways. So here's just a couple of questions to ask yourself. What would change if you were in community with others, others who share a common goal or motivation with you? What's the greatest barrier to you building community or maintaining the ones you have? And how might you encourage yourself and others to intentionally build, maintain, or invite whole community?
Thank you for listening to this Wild Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the Wild Trust platform, and get started with the Wild Trust Index today.